Alright, we're talking about the power differential in the therapeutic relationship, and today we're going to talk about the ways that a therapist can use their positional power, and also the ways that a client can use and exert positional power in the therapy dynamic. So the first is time. A therapist is in charge of setting the beginning and the end of sessions. A therapist has the power to choose to extend a session if they want to, or to end the session early, or end the session right on time. The therapist may also strategically place the clock in a place where they can see it, but the client cannot, which further emphasizes the therapist's control over time. And the flip side of that, the client can attempt to exert some power or gain some power also by using time. They might come to sessions late or try to leave the session early as a way to either actively or passively gain control of the beginning or end of sessions. They might attempt to stretch the end of a session by continuing to talk or refusing to leave when the therapist is trying to end the session, or they might even try to show up on days that they're not scheduled, therefore, monopolizing the therapist's time or taking their time away from other clients, that kind of thing. Setting the stage. The therapist obviously has the capacity to arrange their office in such a way that puts them in a position of power. So that might consist of organizing the seating in a way. A power role might be to have their seat be something that sits up higher than the therapist, so like a high-back executive leather chair that's raised up and you are sitting physically higher than your client, who might be sitting on a simple folding chair or like a waiting room chair or even like a sofa or something that sinks down. And so the client is, sitting down like this, and the therapist is sitting up like this, therefore kind of hovering over the client. The therapist may sit behind the desk, which of course exudes the illusion, or not really an illusion, but gives the therapist more of a power position, being the one behind the desk. A lot of times having the bookshelf behind them, especially filling the bookshelf with, professional text and that kind of thing, is also a power play because it implies the knowledge that the therapist has read these books, understands them, has the knowledge from those books, and the client does not. And while the therapist may have their diplomas and certificates and things on the wall or next to them showing their level of education, often seated next to the client is maybe a box of tissues or something, which I've never really thought about that as being a power play, but it does sort of give the expectation of the client being vulnerable and your role is to sit there and pour your heart out and cry, whereas the therapist's role is to sit there and be, all-knowing and powerful with the knowledge that they have. But in the same situation, setting the stage, a client can attempt to alter or lessen that power differential by trying to sit in the chair that the therapist usually sits in, or to rearrange the seating in a way that makes them feel like they're a little bit more on equal footing. One huge power play that really is a safety issue for the therapist, honestly, so if you are a therapist, you really don't want this to happen, but a client may try to position the seating in a way where they are between the therapist and the door. So as a therapist, you might not always be working with people who are going to behave appropriately. So if you have someone that has a psychotic break or gets really mad or angry in a session with you, you want to be the one nearest to the door so that you can get out of there really fast if you need to. So a power play by the client would be arranging the seating where they are between you and the door And it might not be because they're trying to threaten you, or, at least not consciously, but it does come across a little threatening to the therapist. So if you notice, if you go to therapy, it's usually arranged where when you walk in the door, the therapy desk and where the therapist sits is usually kind of right in line with the door, and the client might be sitting right across from the room. So it's not usually where the client is sitting with their back to the door to where they're placed between the door and the therapist. That's not usually the way that is arranged, and it's for safety reasons for the therapist. Alright, the therapist has the power play because they have the right to ask questions. The therapist is delving into the client's personal life and asking very personal and sensitive questions, whereas the client does not normally have that right. They may try to get the upper hand or even out the power differential some by asking some personal questions of the therapist. And it's some therapists do choose to self-disclose some things. If done right, it can help the bonding between you and the client and can help the therapeutic process, but self-disclosure should be handled very carefully, and to err on the side of caution, it's really not a good idea to disclose your own personal things to your client, so you find a way to deflect those answers, not answer them, but yet you are expecting your client to answer all of those deep-seated personal questions. And that's the difference between a therapeutic relationship. It's not like a friend relationship or a spousal romantic relationship where you're both equally sharing that kind of information. The therapeutic relationship is different, and it does present a power differential because of that. To maintain it, and not anonymity. I said it, anonymity. The therapist has the right to maintain a certain level of anonymity, and the client really does not. However, the client may try to lessen some of that difference, because in this day and age, it's really easy to find out about your therapist or your provider by using the internet, Google searching them or stalking their social media and that kind of thing. Your client can find out a lot about you. They can even delve into court records, because court records are usually public knowledge, so they can go down to a local courthouse and find out details about maybe a painful divorce you went through or a lawsuit that you've had to face, that kind of thing. And that's bordering on some more stalkerish behavior. But there's a lot of stuff like that that is out there in the open, that if someone really wanted to find out the information about you, they could do so, and a client may use that to level the playing field a little bit and feel like there is less of a power difference there between you and them. The therapist has the power to name and diagnose. So, that's part of the therapist's authority, really to define what is normal and acceptable and what is not. So you get to name someone borderline personality or bipolar, or something that they're doing is considered abnormal or not acceptable. On the reverse side of that, the naming and labeling, the client can choose to reject the therapist's diagnosis, or some more assertive and aggressive clients may even try to label or diagnose the therapist. Another power play that a client might do is to dominate the conversation. This is also used a lot of times to deflect. So not only are they sort of dominating the conversation and steering where the course of the conversation leads, they might be doing that in order to avoid talking about topics that the therapist is trying to get them to talk about. A client may feel that if they stay busy talking, then it may seem as if they're cooperating when really they are doing what they can to avoid having to delve into some of the more sensitive or painful subjects that maybe they're not ready to discuss yet. And this can also be seen as, some therapists are a little more open to letting the clients take that control because they realize that it may take them some time to feel comfortable getting around some of those topics. But at some point, as a therapist, you need to realize that this could be a way of deflection, and you might need to be a little more direct and take more control of the conversation in the session to get it back on track to deal with the issue, because otherwise you're kind of wasting their time, really. The therapist has the authority to determine the rules of the relationship. So within the bounds of the professional licensure and ethics, some ethics, depending on whether you're a social worker or a marriage and family therapist or psychologist, whatever, most of the ethics are going to be very similar, but some may completely forbid that you accept a gift from your patient, and some may say that it's okay under certain circumstances, such as if it's of small monetary value. Sometimes certain cultures, it would be considered rude to decline a gift, and so to respect their culture, it would be accepted and expected that you accept that small token of a gift. But sometimes it's a hard line not to do that, not whether or not to touch a client in a non-sexual way. I'm talking about therapeutic touch, like reaching out to comfort them by placing your hand on theirs or on their arm or on their shoulder, or giving a hug, or offering support in physical touch, which is important. As humans, we need and crave physical touch, but when you have a power differential there, teachers, clergymen, doctors, therapists are generally discouraged from touching their client or whoever, because you are in a position of more power over them, and those touches could be misconstrued, taken the wrong way. It could be crossing a boundary. For instance, my daughter just graduated high school and is now in college, and she noted a very distinct difference in the way her teachers acted while she was in school when she was their student. The school had a very strict policy against not touching the students, so they were not allowed to hug and that kind of thing. I guess maybe for legal reasons, because you wouldn't want a hug to be taken out of context or whatever. But the minute she graduated, her favorite teacher said, "You know what, you're not my student anymore. Come here, I want to give you a hug," and gave her a big hug. And it made my daughter feel good. I mean, it was not an unwanted hug. It was not an unwanted touch, and it made her feel good. It made her feel loved. It was a good thing that she wished she could have gotten while she was a student, but she understands why she couldn't. Their relationship dynamic changed once she was no longer their student anymore, and she had turned 18 and everything. And I mean, this was a female teacher. It wasn't anything inappropriate or sexual. I'm not saying that. It was the hug that you give someone to show that you really cared about them. And it meant a lot to my daughter to receive that hug, but the rules of the school, the rules that the teachers had to follow, absolutely forbade any kind of physical touching. And I can understand why, and therapists usually need to also follow those rules, and doctors usually to a degree. Now, I've gone through a lot with my cancer diagnosis and everything, and I have had my doctor give me a big hug, so it's not always something that people are not going to do, but if you're a therapist or a doctor or in a position of power over someone else, just definitely use caution when doing any sort of physical touch towards your client. But the way the client might take things into their own hands in that regard and try to lessen the power differential there, they might reach out and do an unwanted touch or hug or even try to kiss your cheek or whatever. So it kind of goes both ways. You need to set those boundaries in place, the rules and the expectations. And if you've done that and your client still attempts to touch you in some way, then in my mind, they are clearly making a power play because you've already told them that that's not appropriate, that that's not something we're going to do. But, some people in some cultures, some people like more of a personal space and some are more touchy-feely, and that is something that maybe you need to take into consideration with your clients. But also as a therapist, you are modeling appropriate behavior. So when you have someone who perhaps doesn't seem to respect those kind of boundaries, and they need some behavior modification, they need some modeling on what is appropriate, then you need to be really strict with how you show them what is and is not appropriate in those situations, and not let them cross those lines, even if it is an innocent touch or hug, you know what I mean? So not all clients are going to accept being in a position in which they feel that they have less power. Some clients, especially today, consider themselves consumers rather than patients. And so there are many ways that the client may attempt to shift the power differential to lessen the therapist's power and increase their own. A few more that we have not talked about yet: draw attention to the higher status. So clients who are extremely wealthy or socially or politically connected or famous in some way, they may use their special status to subtly demean the therapist's position. Fear: a client may try to use threats or make the therapist feel vulnerable in some way, because if they have a history of violent or criminal behavior. Also threatening with suicide. And this is something that people see in relationships a lot too. Your significant other, maybe you broke up with them and they say, "I'm going to kill myself if you break up with me." And so they are coercing you into continuing a relationship with them out of fear that they really are going to harm themselves. And so they're having the power over you when they do that. That's a very difficult place to find yourself in, but you can't let someone control you with a threat like that. As a professional, we are required to take measures and report those kind of things to the proper authorities. You can even put a 72-hour mandatory hold against their will and make them go inpatient for therapy for their own safety when they threaten suicide. But I understand, obviously, that for a layman, someone that, this is happening because you're in a relationship with someone and they're threatening suicide, they're controlling you with that threat, and that is a very difficult situation to find yourself in. But ultimately, an individual is responsible for their own actions, and it's usually a threat. They're usually not going to follow through. But if the worst happens and they do, it is not your fault. You have to set boundaries. You have to protect yourself. You are entitled to be happy and to be with someone that makes you happy, and someone that you feel safe and comfortable with, and someone who is going to threaten and coerce you with threats of suicide or harming you or harming people you love or your pets. That is a completely unhealthy relationship that you need to get out of. And whatever consequences that they choose to do is on them, and it's not on you. So if you've ever found yourself in a situation like that and you are feeling guilty because they did follow through with their threat, please, for one thing, go get some professional help. But know that it is not your fault, that you did nothing wrong, and that you are not responsible for the actions of another person. Okay, moving on. More ways that a client may try to gain power in the relationship: sexual seduction. They may flirt, make passes at the therapist, or dress or act in a way that is sexually suggestive, that is intended to entice the therapist. Legal violation: a client may make false accusations against the therapist or file inappropriate malpractice suits or complaints with their licensing board. and you actually see this a lot with people with borderline personality disorder. That is perhaps one of the riskiest kind of patients or clients for a therapist to have, because someone with borderline personality can flip so quickly when they feel threatened, when they're not getting their way, when you're not completely on their side, agreeing with everything they say. They can be really sweet and seductive. You're the best person in the world, very complimentary, until they don't like what you have to say. And then it can be scary at times. They can fly into a rage. They can try to retaliate. They can file false accusations. A lot of therapists won't see someone with borderline personality because it really is such a risky patient to have. Now, I've heard psychiatrists personally that I've worked with say, the borderline personality are going to be what's going to keep your practice running, because they're pretty much always going to be in therapy, or at least the ones who are very attention-seeking are, because they want the attention of having a diagnosis. They want the attention from the therapist. And they crave that attention, and they're going to be constantly seeking that attention and that approval. And so, you can keep your practice going by seeing a lot of people with borderline personality, but for someone who finds that hard or difficult to treat or very emotionally draining to deal with, just be aware that, that can be a potential risk for your own, practice in a legal manner, but also just draining on you emotionally. So knowledge is power. Anytime you know something about a person, you have power over them. And we've already discussed a little bit about how a client might try to level the playing field and increase their own power by finding out things about their therapist. Google searches, even stalking to the point of hiring a private investigator, or, doing more intrusive searches to find out personal things about you. But this is not just something that's in like a therapy setting. There's something that I've said very often, and it's true and it's sad, but the person who knows you the most can hurt you the worst. How many times have you been in a relationship, a romantic relationship with someone, or a close friend, and when that relationship turns sour, they turn around and use all the things that they know about you to harm you? So when you're close to that person, that's one of the good things about building a relationship. That's one of the exciting things about building a relationship with someone, is that vulnerability that you have with them. Sharing those personal things that you wouldn't want to share with someone else. But making yourself vulnerable, it can bring a lot of positivity to the relationship, bring you closer, but it's also giving them the ammunition to hurt you. So that person that you trusted, that you shared all that with, that has the power to really make a relationship strong and bring you together, the flip side of that is that now they have the power to hurt you. My battery was dying, so I've had to move just a little bit so I can plug in. Alright, but the thing about the power differential in therapy when it comes to the knowledge base, therapy should be a place where you can show all of your vulnerabilities, bare your soul, share your secrets, and you're in a safe place where that is not going to come back to harm you later like it could be, in the relationship situation like I was just talking about. And that's obviously very therapeutic to a lot of people, to finally be able to talk about things like that in a safe place where it's not going to be used against them. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the coercive power that some professions have as part of their positional role. Excuse me. So there are some professions, of course, where they do have a lot of power over people, the power to force people to do things against their will in some cases. So law enforcement officers, judges, parents, excuse me, my face is itching. I have nerve damage from cancer and all that, so it acts up sometimes. Doctors and other mental health professionals have the coercive power to make people do things against their will. So obviously, with judges and law enforcement officers and that kind of thing, actually like putting people in jail or forcing you to do something to pay a fine, or even when it comes to like divorces and child custody cases, you may be forced to pay alimony or child support or not have your children as often as you want or whatever because someone else made that decision for you. But from a therapy perspective, mental health, you have the power to detain someone. It's called a 72-hour hold, to hospitalize them or to treat them or even medicate them against their will when you determine that that is in their best interest. For example, when someone is suicidal or homicidal. And in some cases, such as in forensic investigating or declaring someone competent to stand trial or not, you can literally hold their life in your hands, based on your professional judgment in that situation. So it is a huge responsibility to have. But ways that coercive power is not just limited to the professional. A client can also attempt to use coercive power on the therapist. So a client who is physically stronger than the therapist or who is highly intimidating in some way may possess a coercive power over the therapist. A client who is in a gang or who stalks or threatens their therapist. We've already talked about people who try to control you with suicide threats and also the borderline personality. Even some experienced clinicians, when faced with the borderline personality range, may feel coerced into giving into the client's demands or their wishes, or not to hold firm boundaries for fear of the client's explosive reactions. Reward power is another type of power. Therapists have reward power because the clients are often desiring the approval and love from the therapist. So, not all of these that I'm going to discuss are ethically sound, but these are ways that a therapist may hold reward power over a client. Giving them approval, commending the client on their progress, lowering the client's fees, extending the therapy session time, or seeing the client more frequently, giving the client a gift, which you really shouldn't do, accepting or bartering services from the client, again, you shouldn't do. A predatory therapist may reward the client with sexual advances. You might have the power as a therapist to reward the client by writing a favorable custody report or a probation report, or writing letters of recommendation, or testifying in court on the client's behalf, or something else that is probably crossing a boundary line. It's kind of a gray area, attending your client's ceremonies like birthday parties or graduations or weddings and that kind of thing. But the client can also have reward power over the therapist, especially in times like now when client satisfaction surveys are sent out a lot of times, and you want to meet certain goals on those. The clients may withhold payment, which, money is definitely a good reward. Your client might rate you either favorably or unfavorably on client satisfaction surveys. Word of mouth in the community, again, either negatively or positively. They can badmouth you, or they might refer friends and family to you. So a lot of times as a therapist, a position we find ourselves in is the client is not always going to want to hear what we have to say. And to be the one that has to not really be harsh or mean, but to really hold up a mirror and show someone where they're going wrong or where they need improvement, they might not always like you because of what you have to do. And especially as a social worker, not in a therapy position at all, but doing other things, you're going to be cussed at, you're going to be hated, you're going to be talked bad about, and that is, when we're talking about rewards, that's certainly not it can lower your job satisfaction when you're getting all that kind of negativity and feedback from your client, which is something that social workers have to deal with a lot. But that gets into a whole other topic, such as needing to find approval in other people, to feel good about yourself and that kind of thing. That's going into a whole other topic. The power of admiration. People, as a general rule, want to be admired. They want to be liked, to be attracted to, or to be desired by another person. And so therapists have that kind of power. A client admires you, they respect you, they look up to you. When that's the case, the therapist has power. A therapist who is seen as wealthy or successful may command a certain kind of power. Or if the therapist is very charismatic or authoritarian, they command more power. A therapist has power when they model certain behaviors or self-disclose in order to promote certain attitudes or behaviors in their client. These are all ways that a therapist can have a power. Clients can have power. We've discussed already, maybe in a previous video, clients who are famous, charismatic in some way. They might elicit the therapist's admiration or respect. The therapist may find a client attractive, or may admire them for certain artistic or entrepreneurial qualities that they have. So that kind of gives the client some more power in that relationship. Or clients who have social and or economic power or status. Manipulative clients. There are clients who might go to therapy for the purpose of strategically advancing their claims in child custody cases, for example. A lot of therapists will avoid taking on someone who is in the middle of any kind of legal procedure like this because, number one, they don't want to be drawn into it or to be called to testify on behalf of it, but number two, they often see the clients doing it for other reasons rather than, wanting the actual therapy services. Now, a lot of therapists will see a client after the legal proceeding is done and over with, because then if the client is seeking therapy, you usually are able to tell that they are actually seeking it for the right reasons and not because they're trying to manipulate a legal proceeding or something like that. Misusing the term resistance. This is something that, as a therapist in a position of power, now I'm not denying that resistance is a thing. Resistance to treatment is a thing. But so often, it is so easy as a therapist to label a client as resistant when the client is really not the one at fault. The therapist is basically blaming the client for their own ineffectiveness. So if you are being ineffective as a therapist and you're not seeing progress happen with your client, and if you label them as resistant, not only is that not fair to them, but you're taking the blame off of yourself, but that is something that might carry with them in their chart, in their diagnosis when they go to other people. And if that client is then seen as somehow problematic or resistant, they're going to be approached by other therapists with an attitude of, well, you're a problematic client right off the bat, and that's unfair for that client when maybe they weren't being resistant at all. You just were being ineffective as a therapist. So the therapist has the responsibility in these situations to try a different treatment modality, see if something else might work for that client, or to refer them to someone else if you feel like you're not the best person to do their treatment, or if you're not seeing the type of progress you're hoping to see. Malingering is something that is definitely a big trigger for me, and I'm going to end this video with this. So malingering is when a client or a patient exaggerates or makes up symptoms, usually for the purpose of seeming worse than they really are. It might be because they're wanting attention, or like with medical reasons, it might be because they're wanting pain medicine, or certain drugs in some way, so they might exaggerate their symptoms to make it seem worse than they really are, to get pain medicine or to get Xanax or whatever. Don't make the mistake of labeling someone as a malingerer to justify your inadequacies in treating the patient. And doctors especially. Briefly, I will tell you my experience of being called a malingerer. It was about a week before we found out that I had cancer. I had been sick for a few years. There had been a lot of problems with my health, a lot of symptoms that couldn't be explained. I had every scan, every test, everything done. Doctors could not find what was wrong with me. And so my complaints of my symptoms were not adding up with the findings that the doctors were seeing. I was hospitalized for diverticulitis, and the doctor put in her note, that she suspected malingering on my part. And the reason why is because I was being very honest when she'd come around and ask how I was doing, how I was feeling. My complaints of pain, my symptoms that I was saying that I was having, were not adding up with the reason I was in the hospital. The diverticulitis was not explaining the symptoms that I was having. For one thing, I had the most horrible headache I've ever had in my life. I had so much pain here in my head, my ear, my face, and I didn't know why. I just knew I was hurting. I knew that something was wrong. The doctor was not seeing anything wrong, and so accused me of malingering, and that is now a part of my permanent medical record, and it was incorrect, because a week after that I had a biopsy which showed that I had cancer. Not only did I have cancer, but it was stage 4, highly advanced, and a type that is resistant to treatment. And guess where it was? Yeah, I wasn't making it up. I really had something wrong with me, and I was in a very vulnerable position as the patient. I was seeking help, and I was being treated as if there was something wrong with me, that I was doing something wrong, and instead of getting the help that I needed, I was being treated as if I was, malingering, basically. Alright, that ends this video.